Welcome to the last teaching in our series, Life in the Roman Empire. Now, in the last episode, we said that was going to be the last one, but after releasing it, we realized that there was one more teaching that would be helpful for you to engage with, not only to continue to expand your understanding of the Roman Empire, but specifically how the Apostle Paul strung a host of images together to build the structure to the letter of Ephesians. So our dear friend, Dr. Randall Smith, is going to walk us through what the Apostle Paul did in order to challenge the Christians in Ephesus to be faithful to the kingdom of God in the midst of their cultural context. So part 8, here we go.
The problem with studying culture is there are many little pieces of things you need to know. And when you try to make a quilt, you have to take finished pieces and put them together. So all of these segments that we're giving you need to somehow come together in your thinking. I want to take you for a walk on a Roman street. And because I've told you that Roman streets are Roman streets are Roman streets, Mick Rome, it doesn't matter which of the cities we go to, because they'll all be the same. By the way, traveling America, I'm seeing the same thing. There's a Home Depot across from the Lowe's that's around from the Walgreens that's over from and I can't tell where I am most of the time. It's good to be American. Now here's the thing. Many people read the letter to the Ephesians and they're aware that the last part of that letter has very profound armor imagery. I think almost all of us learned the armor at some point, and Brad did a brilliant job of helping us with some of that. What we might not be aware of is the entire letter of Ephesians is a series of images from the Roman street. From chapter 1 onward, he's talking about something that's going on in his time. Let me just briefly break the book into 3 parts, simply because it's going to help us to manage it. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, Paul is writing to the Ephesians about the call of the believer, how God called you, and the fact that God knew what he was getting when he called you. He's not surprised by what he got. Chapter 4:1 through 6:19 tell the story of 5 walks. He says 5 times, walk, 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 because he's telling you not about the call of God, but about the conduct of the believer. How do you walk as a believer? And then the last part of it, the conflict of a believer, and the part that relates specifically to the armor, okay? And when we're looking at this, I want you to go with me to the room where Paul was as he's sitting there under the light chain of arrest. You have to remember that the light chain is not a chain, it's a metaphor. There's a guy there who has to bring him for a maestas trial. A maestas trial is a trial where you meet face to face with the emperor, and he doesn't have to worry about all the legal conventions. He just basically says whatever he thinks, and that's now the law, okay? So for a maestas trial, he's sitting in a place that he's paying for, the Apostle Paul, and he's got a soldier sitting with him whose lousy duty it is to be with a 5-foot-tall, balding Jew with a big nose who's got a problem. And he's got to get you in front of Nero within the hour when a tribune brings him a message that says Nero's ready to see this guy. If not, it's his neck on the line. He doesn't care about Paul. He cares about his career. But who is he? Well, he's very likely a guy with a specific kind of problem. Now, while he's there, he's observing that Paul's receiving people and receiving letters. He's free to move about the apartment. He can even go out into the market and get himself bread, but that guy's with him all the time, and he doesn't go very far. He's got to be able to get there when Nero calls. Some of the correspondence is coming in, and Paul is hearing about how teachers from Judea are coming to the various churches, like the church at Ephesus. Paul's sitting in Rome. He's under arrest. He's hearing about the Ephesian church and other Gentile churches that have Jews coming that say, if you don't come under the temple leadership, you can follow Jesus as your Messiah, but you're never going to be completely accepted by God unless you add Jesus plus fall in line as a proselyte at the temple. And they're feeling in Ephesus and in other Gentile circles like second-class citizens. Meanwhile, there's a soldier sitting next to him. Now, that soldier very likely grew up as a hairy Gaul. By the way, the territory of Gaul, when Julius Caesar went there, was called technically the territory of the hairy Gauls. That's what they called them. So this guy is a hairy Gaul. Now, here's what's happening. When Jesus is a little boy, this is the first time they start collecting money for a state-paid military. That state-paid military is costing Rome more and more, and by the time of Paul, it's being expensive to run all these campaigns. The provinces have to pay for their own armies. So not only do Roman soldiers abuse the Judeans are taxed to pay for it. That's what causes the rise of the Zealot party. At any rate, all over the land, the taxes are rising. And by the way, killing so many people means we lose so many soldiers and we have to replenish them. We can't make soldiers as fast as we can kill them. So what do? Well, when we take big hairy Gauls, we take them captive, and the captains of the Gauls are given an opportunity to become Roman citizens and become a captain in the Roman army. America found out in Iraq that if you don't hire the army right after you conquer them, they come back to fight you again. But the Romans had a way of dealing with this. So they created an assimilation plan. And barbarians were transformed into Romans in mass numbers, particularly for military purposes. Now, how did you do it? Well, the first thing that would happen is the hairy Gaul would probably get a haircut. But right after that, he would be adopted, like Josephus was adopted by the Flavians. He'd get a Roman name. He would get a token that he would put on his belt that was a token of an inheritance. It had a Roman numeral for a piece of land by the Tiber River. He was never going to live long enough to see it, but he didn't know that. 50 other guys had the same number. He didn't know that. The point is, he's got a token of an inheritance on his belt. And he learns to dress as a Roman. He learns to mimic Romans. He learns to be trained in the ranks. And then he's put back into his rank as a soldier. That's what's happening. So the guy sitting next to Paul is probably a former Gaul who's not getting good frontline duty where all the spoils and glory are. He's guarding this 5-foot-tall, bald Jew. And he's not happy about it. And he's feeling like a second-class Roman. And Paul begins to write, and the first 3 chapters of Ephesians, he writes about how Romans had an assimilation plan, and he talks about God is assimilating you to be a believer because he's adopting you, giving you a token of an inheritance. He's promising you these things. And chapters 1, 2, and 3, if you read them, are imagery that come directly from the assimilation plan. Then you get to chapter 4, and it's stunning because he starts these 5 walks. And every one of the 5 walks is a story right out of the pages of what would happen on the Roman street. So he starts off in chapter 4, verse 1, "Therefore I, the prisoner of the Lord, implore you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling of which you were called." And he takes you to a place of a Roman slave market. Roman slave markets existed in every major city, and Romans were stood naked, and they would wear a titulus, which is kind of a plaque that says, "I speak German and do windows," or whatever, I don't know. But the point is, it would tell what you were able to do. And when you purchased it, this language of walking worthy was that you actually delivered on the guaranteed package of what was sold to you. So he says, you've seen a slave market, you've been bought in redemption by Jesus Christ. I want you to go out and I want you to walk in harmony with what God said you could do when he bought you. I want you to become the version of you that the Spirit of God can make you into, and do not be a hindrance to it. And he said that there are some character traits that go into God's people, like humility and gentleness and patience and tolerance and diligence. And if you will work at these things, you will find yourself becoming what God called you to be. There's a part of your sanctification that is all God, but there's a part of it you're responsible to get up and do. Yes, God changes your heart, but you need to open the book. You're going to have to read the instructions. And then he moves to yet another thing that happens on the Roman street. In chapter 4, verses 7 through 13, he talks about a parade, a Vires Triumphalis, the triumphal parade. And in that parade, he says, you've seen triumphs. You've seen Caesar coming by with a laurel over his head, riding behind the white horses. You've seen them drag in the captives. You've seen the floats. You've seen the sparsiones, the free beer tickets, and all of the jewelry that came from what you took from that campaign. You've been at a parade like this. He says, I want to tell you about what God did. Jesus left heaven, came down to the earth. He saved you. And then he threw out from the float sparsiones, and some are apostles, and some are prophets, and some are pastors and teaching shepherds, and some are evangelists. And these were people trained somewhere else, but parachuted into your life, and God gave them to you. They come from a victory parade. It's an image. And he says, let me take you down the street to that Roman bath. And let me just walk you in and talk to you about what Brad was telling us. It's time for you to change your clothes. Lay aside the old self, he says. It's been corrupted with the lusts of deceit. Be renewed in the spirit of your mind. Put on the new self. What's he doing? He's brought you into an apoditerium so that you could stand there, and he says, you've been to a bath. You know what it means to change your clothes. I want you to get your heart right and get changed. Put on the distinctive clothing of one who walks in purity, and don't be involved in all the things going on at those baths. And he'll tell them how, I want you to take you down the street, and I want you to be able to see yet another place. I'd like you to go to the theater. And when he takes them to the theater in chapter 5, verse 1, he says, listen, I don't want you to mimic the people in the theater. I want you to mimic God. He shockingly says the crude groin humor associated with the theater is not where you learn love. We live in a society that spells love L-U-S-T, and so did they. And that groin humor made their mouths filled with coarse speech. Look at what he said in chapter 5 of Ephesians when he called them not to have that crude speech. Don't imitate actors, imitate God. God's words are true, loving and encouraging and helpful. God's children should speak like their Father speaks, not like Hollywood speaks. And then he takes them outside. When I take groups through Scythopolis and Beit Sha'an in Israel, there's a marker on the pavement. It's a station marker. Have any of you walked the stations of the cross in Jerusalem? Okay, the idea of a station actually originally came from a group of people called the Vigiles. By the way, in Latin, V's are W's. The Vigiles. And what they were markers so that men could come out as night watchmen and walk you through the city. If you happen to have lingered too long at your popine, or if you happen to have stayed at your convivium and your cocktail party a little bit too late, and you're afraid. Remember, there's no CSI in ancient Rome. You die, nobody knows. I mean, they're going to find your body, but nobody's going to know who did it. There's no way to kind of do all the angles. That all comes later. So it's dangerous out there. So there is a watchman, the vigiles. Today, by the way, if you go to Italy, that's the word for fire department. But these originally were the watchmen. And they walked along and stopped at a station marker etched in the pavement. 3rd watch of the night, corner of 3rd and Elm, all clear. And you would look for one of those guys and get under that light and walk under that light and get off as close to your doorway as possible. What Paul says is this: do not be partakers with them. You were formerly darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. The fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn what's pleasing to the Lord. Do not participate in unfruitful deeds of darkness. It is disgraceful even to speak of the things which are done by them in secret. But all things become visible when you're exposed by the light. For everything becomes visible is light. This is the reason he says, awake, sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. He's using the image of someone who gets you through the night. Roman cities were teeming with life all day long, so the carts had to work at night. That's the only way to resupply the market. And along with the carts, the brothels operated. The popine operated. And what was going on the street was dangerous and smutty. And as a result, Paul told believers to be like night watchmen, to be those vigiles around which people could gather and find protection because you were standing in the light, not in the shadow. Paul told people to be like night watchmen that walk in dark streets and carry the light of the truth and bring a measure of comfort to other people who are out there in the cold and trying to find their way. That light will shine in darkness. And then, where did he take you? He took you over to the popine, to the pub, and we just heard about it. Don't be unwise. Don't waste your time. Don't consume it on drink. Don't give yourself to the songs of the spirits because it's loud and boisterous and they don't care if they wake the baby. Give yourself rather to the song of the Spirit, that which encourages the others. Lift up your voice in that and don't be caught up in being driven, but be dominated by God's Spirit. So Paul urged the believers at Ephesus to use the resources that God gave them. He said, I want you to identify the enemy and I want you to put on God's protection. But then he moves to that last section, the conflict of the believer. You remember this? And we looked at this. We saw these soldiers and we defined that. He says, I want you to understand, put a belt of truthfulness. It's not a belt. It's a guard. Your most vulnerable place on your body is truthfulness. You know that you're the person who can most easily lie to yourself. Did you ever tell a story about what was happening when you were growing up and your sister said, that's not what happened, but that's how you remember it? Because you told it in your mind. A belt of truthfulness. He says, listen, put on a belt of truthfulness. Put on a thorax of righteousness, a breastplate of righteousness. What does a breastplate do? It guards your heart. Right choices today guard my heart for tomorrow's problems. So I guard truth. And I guard my heart, and then I put the sandal cleats on that hold me in my identity in the gospel. I am who God says I am, not who my enemy says I am. Now, what's interesting is, in verse 16 of chapter 6, there's the words above all, but the grammar doesn't actually say above all. I want you to see that there are actually two types of armor, and I want you to see that the above all armor is when necessary, when trouble comes. The first three items, the belt, the breastplate, and the sandal cleats, you always have. But when under attack, the other three become important. What are they? Where there's that blocking shield of faith, remember, testudo, get up underneath. But did you know that those shields, those Thoron shields, you have to grab the other guy's arm and lock arms with him to put those shields together. A Thoron is not made for one person, it's made for a wall. So when under attack, when the darts are flying, I want you to grab some people that know and love God and get behind people who have a path of shielding that's already been put in front of them. And then he says, with all of that, I want you to do something else. I recognize that not every Roman soldier had a helmet. Squad leaders had those big flurries on top. And sometimes they were turned sideways, and they followed whistles, but you watched for the whistle pattern and looked for the feathers on the flurries of your colors. Because if you follow the wrong whistle, they're retreating, you're advancing, and you're going to get clobbered. So in the middle of that tension, as they're pushing against us and Gauls are coming on us, what you do is look for the helmet of the guy who's leading your squad. Listen for it and push behind him and break into the enemy. And if the enemy breaks the line, if there's nothing else you can do, you cannot pull out your Rumphia sword. You'll kill 3 guys on your own team trying to get at them. All you've got left is your dagger. Grab that dagger, and if the line breaks, stick him with the rhema of God, the word that God gave you back before the struggle started. All the letter of Ephesians, all of it is imagery. All of it came right out of the pages of the context of the Roman world.